Welcome to our new Where the Stones Have a Story to Tell studio. Today's episode is going to be a totally different adventure. We're setting out to take a look at an 1850s farmstead that's in this forest, Gilbert Hills State Forest in Foxboro, Massachusetts. Originally, I intended to do this as a comparison between old stone foundations and the Native American stone structures out here, particularly prayer seats and enclosures, because we get a lot of comments from people saying, well, aren't things that are really Native American structures just foundations, old stone foundations? We're going to end up doing that comparison another day, because as we dug into this site and learned more and explored more, we found some amazing things that really give a sense of what life might have been like in the 1840s and the 1850s when these things were built. So with that, let's get ourselves into the field and check out Widow White's farmstead from 1850. We are looking at a historical map of Foxboro dated 1850. This shows the layout of the buildings and the people who own those buildings. In particular, we're focusing on this farmstead of the Whites, just north of the Sumners. On the same road, not far from the farm, is the original house of Ebenezer Forrest, the inventor of patent leather, as well as a cotton mill from 1834. You can see it's on granite in that map, and granite still exists today, although this portion of it's called Lakeview. Here's the deed that transferred the land to the Whites. This deed transfers it from Levy White to Preston Avery White. No relation. This deed transferred it in 1847, and it shows that there are two buildings on the property, and this stone wall shows the line between the Sumner and the White property. But it states that there is a barn on the corner of that land, and we're coming up on that barn structure right now. Also, the deeds that transfer that over talk about a dwelling, which we'll cover later. Here, I think, is a fantastic opportunity to take a look at what we see here in the blurb on the side of the screen, the changing evolution of barn construction in New England at this time. Originally, of course, they were all called English barns. This is probably a great example of a bank barn. The bank barns are built into a bank of land, sloping downward, and are generally three-sided with the lowest side open. This would be a basement of a barn, and in the basement they would have storage. Sometimes it would be sort of manure, if you will, settling in. So on that bank on the left, you can see the bottom part, and then as we go around to the top part that is level with the ground and also happens to be level with the street, there would be a door where this could be a hay barn and wagons could be brought right up to it in that spot right there and offloaded or onloaded into the barn. So here we've got an example of a bank barn from the 1800s. We know from the deed to Levy White in 1845, there were no structures mentioned in that deed. So the structures here, such as this bank barn, had to have been built between 1845 and 1847, at least the two that we know of. The one we're headed to now doesn't seem to be mentioned in the deeds, so we can assume it was built after 1847 or when Preston Avery White came into the land. I'm going to mention as we come up here, you might have noticed on the 1850 map, the owner was W.I.D. White, which I presume stands for Widow White. So unfortunately, we can guess that Preston Avery White died between 1847 and 1850. You see a little bit of mortar in the structure of this also U-shaped building or foundation. I'm going to come around the side here. To the left is a large row, not particularly well organized, of boulders. As we come into the front side of this structure, I'm going to assume that this was an animal pen of some sort. It doesn't happen to have the same bank barn attributes where a wagon could have come up to that high side to the right to the straightforward here. So I think it'd be a good guess that in a farm there would be a place to put the animals, and that long row, which we'll look back on in a second, of those boulders to the right, were there to help pen in the animals, and that was a shelter for them. As we head further west down the property line, we're going to take, and that's the boulder line that heads back to that second structure we just viewed. Off to the left here, I think, and this is where we begin to get into sort of the lifestyle or how these people lived. This is an embedded boulder, maybe not of any importance to anybody, except as you get closer, you can see that this was quarried. Those lines are quarry or chisel marks where they separated that rock out and broke it away. And we're going to see possibly where the remnants of that rock were used in the actual dwelling. Now, in the deed to Preston Avery White, and I guess by association Widow White, there was a half dwelling mentioned on it. And I think we're coming up on parts of that now. This is a rectangular, smaller structure. It steps down about 1.5 feet, 2 feet, and we're going to also notice that there was mortar used here. I point out the mortar element because there was no mortar used in that bank barn that I could see, even though it was fairly broken down. But there was mortar in the barn that we just saw and in this. I think this part here, and we'll see it as we back out to the map view again, is either an addition to the dwelling and the main structure we'll see in a second, or it was just another way to put foundations up for other parts, like possibly a kitchen. They may have used these as root cellars, or it could have been a shop. And that half-dwelling reference, I think, is interesting. This is another sort of rectangular foundational structure, like the other one. Both of these rectangular structures line up with, and I'll point it out as we go along here, with the foundation of the main building. Now here's the deed to Preston Avery White and the 1/2 of a dwelling standing on the same. So I've researched that term and found a reference to an old building in Nantucket. Now I'm pointing back toward those smaller portions of the rectangular foundation, sort of line right up to this right side or this near side of the wall. I'm also pointing out that that bank doesn't seem to have a wall. I'm guessing that is actually just buried over time. But back to the half dwelling. In Nantucket, there was a shop that had been used as a shop for years. Then it was built into a half dwelling, so half shop, half dwelling. Today, the term half dwelling actually has a legal meaning, and that meaning is a building with one or fewer bedrooms, a dwelling with one or fewer bedrooms. So we come around to the middle of this, which would have been the half dwelling. And you may be asking, well, how do you know this is the dwelling building? And we're going to get to that in a second. But let's look at the sort of pieces and parts. I'm coming up on a chunk of mortar that was laying loose here. So this foundation was also mortared. We're also looking into just a chunk of brick. Now, right in the middle of that is this stone I'm pointing at here. And that had the same type of chisel quarrying markings as the embedded boulder. So we can see that these folks had to chisel their own stone for their dwelling. I point back now to the structure and those two little rectangular objects lining up with portions of the main structure. So I think they were all one building, whether it was the original building or additions, hard to tell. Now, this is how I've come to the conclusion that this was actually the dwelling, the home, because right next to it, within about 2 paces, is a well. Here's the remnants of the well. And we now, from here on out, we're really going to get a sense of sort of the living situation for the folks in 1850, and in this case, Widow White, where the dwelling is there, not very big, obviously. The well is only a few feet away. We're going to see now some artifacts that are sitting in the woods. These are 2 remnants of buckets and a downspout, a metal downspout, which we're going to actually, oddly enough, see again as we walk through the woods. But there's the well, and we're heading this direction. We're heading north down a hill. As we head down this hill to some other interesting aspects to this farmstead, we're going to come across an oddly coincidental artifact, which is also a metal downspout portion and 2 buckets. I have no idea if those are related. I've sort of looked that up, couldn't find anything. As you know, if you follow this channel, I'm not a big believer in coincidence, but these are obviously very old. I would assume that they are dated back to that mid-1800 time period. If you are also knowledgeable about this forest, which is Gilbert Hill State Forest, you may be thinking, well, that could have been a location for the CCC, the Conservation Corps people that did a lot of work in the 1930s. But I went back and found all of their records, and they did not set up camp in this area. We were headed down the hill. I think that last pile of rocks was actually used for the foundations, but here's a pit. And now we get into really the details, more of the details of the living situation. And this is the trash pit. We're looking at a broken handle of some pottery. There's a piece of glass. We're going to find a lot more glass. Here's the other side of that handled pottery, presumably a jug of some sort. We've got a number of bottles here. Maybe Preston Avery drank a bit too much, and that's why he died here in the 1840s. However, oddly enough, there's no record of his death, his marriage, any children. This is another fascinating object here, which is a teapot. You can see those holes in the back keeping the sort of the tea leaves from heading into the teacup, if you will. Presumably that's how they used it. But here is a 175-year-old teapot, which I think is very interesting. Now we're going to get into the last structure, which is going to be very, depending on how you look at it, interesting discovery here, where this is just a pile of stone. So I'm approaching it. I do not know what it is when I'm coming over here. I can see this trench, though, down the hill, coming down from the building. And so we're going to stick the GoPro down into this. It turns out to be a hole. And at first I thought it was a well, but in fact, I don't believe it's a well. I believe it is what's called a cesspit. This is where the output of the individuals that lived in this house ran down that hill and into this pit. There's a ring around to the side, and that ring is made of clay, so we can still see it is from that same period of time, very similar clay to the pottery in the trash pit. We're going to now follow this trench that leads into the cesspit up the hill. And I think what we can deduce when we get to the top of the hill is the location of the outhouse of these people in the 1840s and the 1850s. This is a common way to handle the output of people in that time, which is an outhouse and then a trench that would allow the rainwater to move all of that down the hill. I suppose we can also come to a conclusion as to the location of the prevailing wind direction in the 1850s would have been headed this way from the dwelling we're headed toward, presumably so that cesspit was not affecting the people in the house very often, or as often as possible. But where I'm pointing is essentially where the outhouse had to be for these people. So we're really getting a sense of how they lived. This is 20 paces, I'm counting it off now in the video, back toward the dwelling. And here's the layout of the entire place. We had the bank barn, animal barn, quarried stone, those small parts of the domicile, then the well, and now the trash pit and the cesspit, heading back up here to the well and the dwelling, or half dwelling. So we get a sense of the objects they left behind, how large this was. We walked to this entire structure without cutting video. Not very large. The deed had 2 acres in total. It's hard to tell what these folks were doing, but I will say that I went back quite a bit to both the Whites and their neighbors, the Sumners. There's a lot more information on the Sumners. They were 8th generation in the United States or the colonies when they came in. But fascinatingly enough, there's no reference to Preston Avery White in the birth, marriage, or death notices in this era, and nor did I ever find the first name of Widow White in any record. She was not mentioned on the deeds or any other records in Foxboro that I could find. Well, I hope you found this presentation as interesting as it was to me to make it. As I mentioned at the outset, I originally put this together to address comments about Native American structures in this forest not being Native American origin, but being farmer foundations, building foundations. We're going to do that in another episode, but as I got into the details, there was so much out here. I thought it was super fascinating just to cover what the world looked like to these people in the 1840s and the 1850s, how they lived, the positioning of their well and their trash pits and their cesspits and their animal barn, and how they're quarrying their own stone out of their property to make the foundations of their dwellings and the like. Hopefully you found this interesting, and as always, I really appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.